Welcome to the Nick Blevins Family Ministry Podcast. Our goal is to help you maximize your church's potential. You'll hear from top leaders in children's, student, and family ministry about the principles and practices they use. Now here's your host, Nick Blevins.
Hello and welcome to the Family Ministry Podcast. It's episode 103. I cannot believe that we're one more week away from 2 years. 2 years of the podcast running. In some ways, it feels like that many episodes. In some ways, it feels like it's 3 months. It goes by fast for sure. So we're coming up on 2 years here. Thank you for everybody who listens, who subscribes, who comments, leaves a rating, shares it. Really appreciate that. I hope it's helpful to you. The idea from the beginning was to just have conversations with ministry leaders where you could walk away with some practical ideas and things that you could implement in your ministry. And so today's conversation is no different. I interviewed Kellie Krueger. I was talking to Kellie at the Orange Conference. I didn't know Kellie. We met. We were kind of in a breakout group. We were having a conversation. And some things stood out to me. Kellie has a very high percentage of her volunteers in her children's ministry are students. So if you're a children's minister, children's pastor, or a student pastor, I think you'll find this interview to be interesting. We also talk about kids camp. It's this week of camp, day camp they do for kids, and how students serve at that as well. So I found it to be fascinating. It's unlike most churches I've ever heard in terms of the percentage they have in terms of students serving and how they use them and what roles they can serve in, the structure and all of that. So we talked through all of that in this episode. I think you'll find it to be helpful. Kellie also shared a bunch of documents and resources they use kind of with onboarding volunteers, of which you'll see most of hers are students. But you can get all that and more in the show notes at nickblevins.com/episode 103. Let's go ahead now and jump into my conversation with Kellie Krueger about how students serve at their church. Well, I'm talking with Kellie Krueger today. Welcome to the podcast, Kellie.
Hi.
Tell us about yourself, your family, your church before we jump in and talk about some cool things you have going on.
Sure. So, my name is Kellie Krueger. I am our families director at Beachcities Community Church in Huntington Beach, California, smack in the middle of Orange County. I am in my dream job. I think most people always ask, I'm 34 years old and they say, okay, what's your ideal job? Where do you want to be in 10 years? My answer is always, man, I just hope I don't get fired. That's my goal because I love what I do. I love families, kids, parents, all ages. My background prior to being in ministry as a career is more on the education side of K-3 education. Ministry-wise, I've been in high school and college ministry for a really long time. So this really is the ideal place for me to be. My husband, Andy, and I have been married for 10 years. And we have one son, Uriah, who is 6 and is probably the quirkiest kid I have ever met. And that's what I love about him. So we're here in Orange County doing that at Beachcities.
That's awesome. Huntington Beach is a hard place to serve at a church. I feel for you. I feel bad. I feel really bad for you.
We live in everyone's vacation spot, so it could be worse.
You do. So we met at Orange Conference this year. And in part of the conversation that we were having in kind of a breakout group, I was intrigued by when we were talking about students serving and what that looked like at your church. It definitely stood out. It's not, I would say, is different from most answers I hear. And so we want to talk about that, but also want to talk about this kids game thing you do a week for kids. And I'd like to unpack that. And then maybe we could talk about students and serving and what that looks like at that event, but also what it looks like in your church during the week. So let's start with kids games. Tell us a little bit about what is that? How did it start? For anybody, obviously most people aren't sure what that is. So give us an idea of how it got started and what is it and how successful has it been?
Yeah, so kids games is a very interesting phenomenon. It's not actually something that we started so much as it's an idea that was handed to us. A few years ago, one of our staff members at the church was invited on a mission trip by a friend of his that works at another church down in San Diego. He went to Egypt and they ran this kids game style camp. It's kind of a fascinating idea, concept, movement. If you go, there's a website, it's kidsgames.com, and you can get information, there's details, resources, provide all those things, but it's not necessarily an organization. There's nobody that works there. The website itself is kind of self-run where you can register as an organization that does kids games and upload ideas and interact with the community. So it's kind of a cool community of believers around the world, actually, that are doing kind of this style of ministry and style of camp which is pretty interesting. So when he came back, this particular staff member from this trip that he went to that was to Egypt, he said, I think we could do this here. There are a handful of churches that do it in the States. It's mostly overseas, but he said, I really think that style works here really well. Let's try it out. And at the time, our church was kind of trying to figure out, we weren't doing any sort of summer camp or VBS for kids, trying to figure out what they wanted to do. I wasn't even on staff quite at that time. I was a volunteer at that time. And so we kind of just took it and ran with it and tweaked it a lot to fit our context and what we needed. And it morphed into something that only vaguely resembles the original idea and concept, but the name and the core ideas are the same, which is basically the idea that unchurched people aren't necessarily always going to be interested in coming to it, sending their kid to a church camp or a VBS sort of a thing, but they're much more open to the idea of sending their kid to a sports or creative arts camp. So all that to say, in our context, Kids Games is a sports and creative arts camp for kids 4 years old through 5th grade. What that looks like is, we have a lot of churches in our area that offer we do basketball camp or cheer camp or whatever it may be. We kind of offer everything. So we offer 17 different electives. And what that means is when a kid signs up for camp, it's real similar to kind of like a high school or middle school schedule where you have your regular core classes you're going to, and then you get to sign up for those fun electives. In this case, we have 17 things a kid can choose from that they're going to do all week long. So they're going to choose to be in the soccer elective or the cooking elective or musical theater or Lango engineering, jujitsu, cupcake wars, woodworking. We have all sorts of stuff. So we have stuff for any sort of interest. We have sign language. I think this year we're offering Spanish. There's pretty much something for everyone. So they choose an elective, and then throughout the day, they're spending a good chunk of their time doing that elective, but then they're also doing some of the more traditional things that someone might be familiar with in terms of what a summer kids camp looks like, from Bible stories to crafts and music and games and all that kind of stuff. So that's what Kids Games looks like practically. There's a lot that goes into it, but I think that's probably in a nutshell the best explanation of what we do.
Cool. I don't think I realized it had all the other components because, creative arts with game, kids games, I think of sports or, athletics and things like that. But obviously you've got a lot of diverse things in there. It's a day camp?
Yeah, so it's a day camp. So it runs from 8:30 to 12:30 each day. And it really does run a lot like a high school schedule. So they're rotating through activities, which I don't think is super unique. In our context, it's just unique what they're actually rotating to. And it's for a whole week. So it's Monday through Friday. And then we have what we call Celebration Weekend is that weekend at our church. One of our unique challenges, and I think in this whole kind of Kids Games journey for us, we've had a lot of really unique challenges and curveballs that have been thrown at us that in hindsight, we can see God really clearly working and going, hey, I want you to innovate here or come up with a different solution here that has really formed and shaped the ministry in ways I don't think we would have, but we're so thankful for. And one of them is that our church campus is actually fairly small. And so there was no possible way when we started looking at doing something like this, there's no way we could even do this in our building. We don't even have anywhere for somebody to play soccer, or we don't have even an outdoor area at our church. And so it forced us to look at other venues. And so we run kids games at local elementary schools. They happen at the schools because that's the facility that works for us. That's the facility that makes the most sense. We've had some really good relationships that we've built with the school district and with a few local schools around here, which is also kind of a cool thing that has come out of that. But basically at the end of the week, so they come to camp Monday through Friday at the elementary school. We invite them all back to the church that weekend, and we have what we call Kids Game Celebration Weekend, which is an entire service that is Kids Games themed. So it's not like, oh, come and you're going to sing one song in front of everybody and then we're going to have a regular church service. The entire service is meant for Kids Games campers and their families.
Do you host this at one school, or is it to the point where it's in multiple schools in one summer?
Well, that is an interesting question. We used to do 2 separate weeks, and we would do it at 2 separate schools. Because we had the amount of kids that wanted to do it. We wanted to get out there. The problem that we had is, honestly, it was burning our people out. Putting on 2 weeks of camp over the summer was killing our people. Our volunteers were exhausted. And what we really found is that when we were doing 2 weeks of camp, we were having about 1,000 campers spread over those 2 weeks, but only about 850 of them were unique. So we had a lot of kids doubling as well. So a few years ago, we kind of shook our heads and said, we can't do this anymore. Everyone's going to die. So we went to 1 week with more kids. And so now we run just 1 week of camp with a lot more kids. We had to make a lot of adjustments just in a lot of our systems and processes that I think were good. It made us refine a lot of things and get better at a lot of things. For us, that was a better move. We've grown to the point now where we're back at that point of, okay, what do we do? We're outgrowing the elementary campus that we're at. We don't know that we want to add more weeks of camp. Do we move to a bigger location? Do we that's like our current problem that we're trying to solve. What seems to be the easiest would be to move to a bigger location. We're not sure we're ready for that. There's some challenges that come with that for us. So we're currently figuring that out, to be honest.
Cool. Now, a lot of people listening might do VBS, or maybe they're student ministry and they do like a camp in the summer or fall retreat or something like that. They're used to, most listeners, planning something large. Obviously, 1,000 kids, really large. But just generally speaking, what's the plan look like? Do you start planning it a month after the one ends? Is it a 6-month run? Like, you know.
Kids games is a year-round thing, man.
That's what I figured. Yeah, that's what I figured.
When we very first started, I was a volunteer. The very first year we did kids games, which I think that would have been 2012 was the first summer we did it. I was only kind of marginally involved. I was a volunteer. I had just had my son, was being like the new mom that was trying to, read all the books and do all the things and have boundaries and family first and all the stuff. So they had asked me to help. I have a background in a lot of camping ministry, and I went, I'll help with a few things. So I was kind of around. And that summer just realized, hey, look, I think this is really what God has called me to. I think this is something he has in front of me. And ended up coming on staff about a year and a half later after putting in a lot of time working year round on kids games as a volunteer and doing that part-time for a few years before I came on full-time in the families role. From a planning aspect, what we used to do is we would start planning in usually the end of September, beginning of October. We'd start looking at, themes and programming and what do we want to do and what are activities, and let's start building everything. And it was great. We put a lot of work into it. We had a lot of really talented people. But again, it was killing us. And so a few years ago, we switched to using the Orange VBS curriculum and realized that even though our context is a lot different than a lot of VBSs, a lot of the stuff about the Orange curriculum is really similar to what we were doing, or we could tweak and make it work in our context. We started that. This is our second year doing that. It's taken a lot of the pressure off. So now we probably officially start in January of each year. Okay. There's a lot of kind of, side conversations and one-on-one things that are happening and pulling of strings in the background throughout the year of getting people on board with different things. But really we start our first core meeting. I have a core leadership team for kids games of it is 6 people. 4 of those are staff members on our families team. 1 is a church staff member that is not on our families team. And then 1 is actually a absolutely rock star volunteer. So the 6 of us start officially meeting in January. We have a few meetings, lay a few things out, figure some things out. And then in March of every year, we have what we call our leadership kickoff, which each of those 6 people that's kind of overseeing a certain area of camp, or like department as we may call it, they have their leadership within their little area. So we have a leadership kickoff, and that's about 25 or 30 volunteers usually that are coming to that. That's just a big vision cast mostly. Where are we going this year? What are we trying to do? Get them excited about, the ways God is using them in this ministry. And then a few weeks later in April, we have a giant volunteer kickoff. And then from that time on, we call it kids game season. That is a term in our church. Like, it is kids game season, game on, all kids games all the time.
That's great. Now, I think a common challenge or question with anybody that's doing some type of a camp, and I'm thinking more VBS than like a student retreat or something like that. There's the idea of, what is the ultimate goal? And then specifically, is it evangelistic? Like, is it part of the idea to get, kids who are coming who are not a part of any church? If so, how do you do that? How do you measure it? What's that like for kids games? Is it, obviously you're reaching a lot of kids, so I'm guessing it is mostly about reaching kids and families in the community. How has that worked? How do you know? I think that's one of the areas where when it comes to anything we do, if our goal is to reach families who aren't a part of our church, we need to know how well we're doing. Do you know that with kids games?
We do. And we had a simple answer to that early on. We actually ask on our registration forms. We do everything online because that's how the world works these days. And one of the questions on our camp registration is basically, what is your campers or families' experience with church? There's like a little kind of asterisk note that says like, it's worded something along the line of, this isn't going to influence their camp participation or registration. It's just for informational purposes. And then we give the option to say that they have no experience, some experience, or lots of experience, or I think there's like a regular experience option. For us, last year, we had 32% of our families that said some experience, 14% that said none, which the none always blows me away, because if I'm registering for like a church camp,
yeah,
I'm probably going to put some, and like we went to church camp last year, so okay, we've done some church camp stuff.
Yeah.
The none always blows me away, because that really means none, in my opinion.
Oh yeah, because half the 32% is probably none.
Oh, for sure, right? They're going, oh yeah, well we've gone to church camp. That's our church experience. We have some.
I went to a wedding 2 months ago.
Right?
Yeah.
So roughly half of our campers every year come from not churched families, and we know that, and that definitely causes a little bit of messiness sometimes. We have people who send their kids of other religions. That's something we've encountered and dealt with. We have people that have sent kids that are transgender, even at that young age, and comes with that, like all those complications and things we got to figure out. We're definitely walking through that mess in that piece, but that's really, like you said, that's our goal and our heart behind it, that this is a way that we can interact with our community, with those in our community that don't know Jesus, in a way that's attractive to them and a way that they want to be involved. From that standpoint, what's funny to me is we run kids games, and the cost for kids games, if they get in on that, we have like an early bird registration, it's $100. Once it's regular registration, it's $125. Most people who are churched see that number and just like can't believe it. That is so expensive. They're coming from the context of VBS costs $25 or it's free or whatever. The non-churched look at that number and go, I'm paying $125 for a week of childcare or for a week of cooking camp. Like, that's nothing. That's a deal. Sign me up for that. Which is
totally. Yep.
Yeah, which is great. That's super attractive to them. We are really, really mindful in our parent communication. We send out daily emails. So every day when the kids go home, the parent is getting an email that, here's a recap of what happened today. Here's what's happening tomorrow. We're really mindful in those emails that, half the people reading them are really not churched. We're really mindful in the way that we present things to families and to parents. We're really mindful, especially a big part of our celebration weekend, something we talk about a lot throughout the week, but especially celebration weekend, is about the reluctant dad. The dad that got dragged there because his kid went to camp and she was in musical theater. So now at celebration weekend, she's performing her little musical theater thing. And so I have to be here, but I'm going to stay with my arms crossed because I don't really want to come and my wife made me. That's the guy that we want to really pleasantly surprise and go, oh, that wasn't painful and that wasn't difficult and it was shorter than I thought. And these people seem normal. That's really important to us. And in fact, we see huge numbers throughout the year coming to our church. When you ask, hey, how did you hear about Beachcities? Why did you come here? It's through kids games. Well, we came to kids games and then we figured we'd check it out. My friend, and anecdotally, and there's so many of them, I don't know the data on it, but we hear the stories so often. And I even know just one just recently. A kid came to kids games with his friend, invited his friend, not a church family. Kid came to kids games. A few weeks later, he showed up at a church event, a family's event that we had, because, okay, yeah, I want to go with my friend. This was fun. Fast forward a few months, mom, who's never been in church, starts attending church because her kid is attending church. Fast forward a few months to that, dad, who's never come to church in his life and has no interest, is coming to church with mom because we're offering a parenting class. And mom said, hey, let's go to the parenting class together. Now he's sitting in church with her, and then they go to the parenting class after that. And to see that whole family within the course of about 18 months go from completely unchurched, no interest, to being like fully plugged in and thriving around here, and getting saved that way. That's why we do kids games. That's the big picture. That's what we're really doing there. And we try to never lose focus of that.
That's great. And you could probably, we've done this too, where we want to know like what are the actual numbers, and it's easy just to go look and figure out, okay, who came to kids games and who has attended since, you know,
right?
Who wasn't part of the church before. So I feel like sometimes we have to. It's not as quite as easy as just a few searches, but we've even done it, you know, tediously over like a manual thing before. You know, it's like, here's all the names of the people who aren't part of our church. Now let's figure out, you know, how if they've come back at all. So when we were talking, the thing that obviously sparked a lot of our conversation, and even why I wanted to have you on the podcast, was about how students serve at kids games and on Sunday. So before we kind of transition to Sunday, what does it look like in terms of how students serve as a part of kids games, and how has that changed over the years?
Students are a huge part of the kids games machine. We've steadily grown and grown over the last few years. I was actually excited after we had talked and you were like, hey, let's talk about this more. I went, okay, shoot, like I should make sure I know the actual accurate data and didn't just make that up. I mean, I know it, but like I need to know for sure. And went back and re-looked at some things even more closely and looked at previous years. And what I found is that in 2015, 57% of our volunteers were under the age of 18 at kids games. And we've grown and grown all the way to this year. We're at about 75% of our volunteers under the age of 18. And that number's probably even grown since I looked that up, because I think we've gotten about almost 40 or 50 more signups since then. But students are a major part of what happens at kids games. We couldn't do it without them. And I think that's something, as I look at kind of like I mentioned, these ways that God has kind of pushed us and nudged us in directions that we might not have gone otherwise. I think that's one of them, that in what we created, and these like kind of big lofty aspirations that we had for kids games, it was going to be impossible to do it without kind of searching every nook and cranny for every volunteer we could possibly get. I love about kids games that any demographic of person, there's a seat for them on the bus. Any skill, talent, gift, like ability, desire, any of it's there. But the biggest one is it really pushes us to get our students involved, and they like it. They're having a great time. They're excited to be able, you know, like a lot of our students are helping out coaching these electives, or are bringing kids to the electives, and they're basketball players, and now they're coaching basketball for a week, or they're, you know, dancers and they're coaching dance, or they're into cooking or Legos or whatever it may be. So it's a really fun way for them to get involved. It's really attractive. In terms of what that looks like recruiting wise for us, it's a lot of word of mouth of students. It's a lot of them inviting their friends, which means we need to create an experience that's worth their time, that they want to invite their friends to. So that means everything from making sure our volunteer t-shirts are actually cool. It is actually really important that our volunteer t-shirts every year are shirts that somebody wants to wear outside of that week. And they do, and it's great, and they're proud to wear them. From making sure that there are little perks for the volunteers throughout the week, from our volunteer snack. I honestly have students who tell me the only reason they volunteer is for volunteer snack, because it's amazing. We have some amazing women who have just like poured into just loving on volunteers, and all day long, from like, I don't like plan any food or meals that week because I know that I'm going to get fed breakfast, I'm going to get fed lunch, I'm going to get fed way more things in between those two than I should ever eat. From little perks, all of our volunteers get little, whether it's like little sunglasses that the kids are also getting, little things. That kind of stuff goes a long way for students. For them, for a lot of them, even though they're serving and their mentality is to serve, they kind of feel like it's camp for them as well. And they're into that. And in fact, this is the first year. This year, we have never taken junior high students to a summer camp, which I know is like crazy and whatever. And we actually are this year. This is the first year we are. But prior to that, most of our junior highs would have told you they felt like their summer camp experience was serving at kids games. Mm-hmm.
Now, with 3 out of 4 volunteers being students, 1 out of 4 being adults, how does that work in terms of the structure? What do they do? What do adults do? Do they play, you know, big time leadership roles, and that's how the numbers work? You know what I mean? Like, because I think anybody listening can even apply that to any area, really. Whatever however you talk about doing it there, we could take and apply it to our Sunday morning, or, you know, VBS or a retreat or something like that.
We definitely have a lot of adults in those key roles. So in terms of our leadership structure, like I talked about before, I have my 6, and then they all have, depending on kind of what areas they oversee, camp's kind of broken up into 6 different areas. They have their teams that they've put together that are mostly, 4 or 5 people that are coordinating different things. Those are all adults. Our biggest slice of the pie, I guess, for volunteers for students is what we call our guides, which is basically our camp counselors. So when a kid comes to camp, they're put in a group of about 8 to 10 campers that are all in the same elective. So like we have our group of boot camp boys or our group of cheer girls or whatever it may be. That 8 to 10 students has what we call a guide who's basically guiding them through camp for the day, hence the name. And they usually have an assistant guide. So typically the guide is going to be a high school student and they may have 1 or 2 assistants that are in junior high. Is normally how it works. Each of those guides reports to what we call a lead. So a lead is a more seasoned, competent, veteran adult that has about 8 to 10 guides that are reporting to them. And the lead's job throughout the day is really just to help those guides and support them and resource them however they may need, from anything from, discipline problems that a kid may not be equipped to handle to, Jimmy threw up. I don't know what to do about that because I'm 12, and helping them with that, to just kind of, sometimes, some of those guys need a little nudge back to like, hey, remember, camp is not for us. All those different things. Our leads are incredible. And we're really honestly looking for people when we recruit for those positions. A handful of them come out of our children's ministry. A handful of them come out of our student ministries. That to me is really important. It's important to our student ministry guys here at Beachcities that if this is where all their kids are serving and growing and changing and developing, that their volunteers need to be there with them. Our head, so we've got 10 leads, say. Our lead of the leads, if you will, is our high school director here at Beachcities. He's recruiting those people. He's managing them. He's helping them figure out how to manage and support all those students. So there's a pretty good structure in place for that. That's not the only place that students serve within camp. They're kind of everywhere, but that structure more or less looks similar, whatever area it is. So there are definitely adults that are overseeing things. At the same time, we're not ever afraid to put a student in a role if they're ready to be in it. We've had students that are head coaches for electives before. It's not common, but we've had it. A lot of our coaches for electives are young adults that are 18 to 22 that were guides the past few years at kids games, and now they've kind of moved up into that coaching position. If they're ready to do it, we want to put them there and support them in that, because I think it's really important. And I think if we wait too long, right, if I wait to say, okay, I'm going to wait till this kid is a senior in high school, and then maybe I'll give him a leadership role. Well, bad news for me, because next year he's graduating and probably moving away, and I just put all that time into him, and that's great. But for my purposes, now I got to start over. So why would I not start with a freshman or sophomore that we see a lot of potential in and bring them along so that by the time they're ready to really lead, we've got a good year or 2 of them within our system that we're actually getting a little bit more out of our investment that way. That may sound like a little selfish, but I think it works, and I think it works for them too.
It sounds like good leadership development, really.
Right.
You know what I mean? Like thinking long term and helping them grow at the right pace with the right experience.
And in terms of kids games, we have a lot of college students that come back for the summer to work at kids games. So that's definitely paid off as well. That time we've invested into them because they come back and work it. And now we don't have, they started as a 14-year-old we saw a little potential in, but now they're 21 and can really lead something. And that's been phenomenal.
Do you pay any of the folks that do like at the lead or the coach level, or is it all volunteer?
No, it's all volunteer. So we have, we typically have somewhere, give or take, around 400 volunteers every year. None of them are paid. Not even my volunteer that's part of our core team. She is not paid. So it's completely volunteer run. And that blows my mind, to be honest, when I really think about it. Sometimes we have dads that take a full week off of work to volunteer at kids games. We have moms that take a week off of work to volunteer at kids games. We have people that are taking their vacation time, that are giving hours and hours and hours. Nobody is paid, which is kind of crazy. We have a lot of amazing people who are really highly motivated to put the gospel out into the community and get people involved with what's going on in our church, and they want to be there.
Yeah. Now, this isn't just unique to kids games. You have a lot of students serving in children's ministry and kind of like your normal weekly Sunday environments at the church. Tell us a little bit about what that looks like in terms of students serving in children's ministry and kind of regular, weekly roles.
Yeah, we definitely, a lot of, first and foremost, we use kids games hugely as a recruiting tool for students and adults, really. But hey, you liked this? Did you know you could do more of this? Like, come check it out next weekend. So it looks really similar the way our weekends are structured and our weekend teams are structured. And even the percentages are pretty similar. So, again, when we talked, I had kind of been like, okay, I'm pretty sure it's like 70% of our volunteers in our children's ministry are students. Like, I'm really confident in that just from walking the halls and all the things. And then I went and looked at the data. And at first I was really disappointed and not sure what was wrong with my brain, because I looked at all of our rosters, and on our roster, about 53% of our volunteers are under 18. And I went, okay, wait, that's not matching up with what think I'm seeing. Am I like unaware? Am I exaggerating that much? What's going on? And then I decided to look at our actual week-to-week schedule at who's actually there, active and showing up. And it jumps up to about 73% of those volunteers being under 18. And we actually have a lot more than that. We allow junior hires to volunteer. Once they're in sixth grade, they can volunteer in our kids ministry, and in the younger, like in the preschool classrooms. We don't put junior hires on our schedule, mostly because they're not super dependable. They're not in control of their own schedule. They can say they want to be there, but if mom says, hey, we're supposed to be at grandma's today, or you have a game or whatever, you just can't always depend on them, even though they have the best of intentions. So we have a pretty good number of junior high volunteers that are pretty consistent and pretty phenomenal that we don't even have on our schedule or our roster, simply so that we don't end up in the lurch when they can't come. So it looks pretty similar in that sense in terms of the ratio of what's going on. We have a lot more students in leadership in our kids ministry than we do at kids games. The way we structure our classrooms, our kids' classrooms, is we have a classroom lead who kind of oversees the classroom, is interacting a lot more with parents, is the one that's prepping a lot of stuff, and then we have small group leaders that are interacting more with the kids. I would venture to say that on any given service on a weekend, we have 4 services each weekend. Well, 3 that we offer children's ministry at. I would offer to say that ratio holds pretty true as well. There's about 70 to 75% of the classroom leads that are running the classroom are high school students.
That's awesome. And are they responsible for leading the leaders in the room too?
Yeah, they are, and to varying degrees, depending on, just the people that are in that group and in that classroom. But they're very much empowered to run the classroom the way our children's ministry. We have 2 full-time staff in children's ministry. So we have an early childhood director and a K-5 director. Both of them, the way they run their ministries is they have what they call their huddle that's happening before. That's when volunteers are arriving. They're spending some time kind of casting vision, motivating, going over any logistics for the day. They send out their kind of lessons and curriculum earlier in the week. So the hope is that volunteers have looked at it before they arrive. That's hit and miss, right? That's just kind of how it is.
Mm-hmm.
Usually the classroom leads have looked at it because they know they're going to have to be the one to know. They have that huddle, they go over stuff, and then they just release people into their classrooms to get started and get going. And at that point, those classroom leads are in charge of what's happening in the classroom.
Now, how do you recruit, train, and retain student volunteers? Because I hear 53%. You were disappointed, and I was thinking that seems pretty high. When I talk to church leaders, I don't know many church leaders who say half of our volunteers are students. I know plenty that say a quarter or a third, so it's not like it's that far off. And you were disappointed until you dug in, which I think it's interesting that you found out that once you looked at active volunteers, the number was higher. It's kind of funny that it's almost saying that the student volunteers are more reliable.
Right. Whole nother like can of worms to dig into, right? Because I did think about that, right? Okay. So what is the deal with our adults? What do we need to figure out there? That's a whole nother podcast.
Yeah. You're going to dive in and figure it out and then come back and tell us what happened. But I think, I and everybody listening would love to hear, how did you get to this point? Like, how do you recruit, train, develop them, retain them? I wonder if it started a lot lower years ago and then you put some things in place, or, maybe it is kids games. Maybe that's just such a great pipeline into serving. I don't know, but what are your thoughts? What do you do specifically to get student volunteers to serve?
I think a lot of it, I can't take credit for a lot of it, and that I think it was a culture of the children's ministry even prior to me being there. Our K-5 director is phenomenal in terms of her level of investment in students and wanting to really see them develop in their faith, in their leadership, in their skills, all of those things. And so I think for years she's been, recruiting students and investing in them, bringing them along. So there was a lot of it that existed, way pre-me. And it's funny because I often forget or don't even realize, or didn't even realize, to be honest, until we had talked, that it wasn't more this way for most churches, even though I kind of know that because it's just so much a part of our culture. And I think the pieces that drive that, I think there's probably about three big drivers of that, maybe four. The first one being a lot of partnership with our student ministries, that our high school and junior high directors both fully understand and are passionate about getting their students plugged into serving and what that can do for a student. And they're also very hands-on and involved with a lot of our families or children's events because, like I said before, their students are the ones serving there. And so it's in their best interest to also be there and be a part of that and be guiding them and see it as an opportunity for their ministry to grow and for their students to grow. And they really do see it that way. So it's not something where we're coming to the junior high and high school guys and going, hey, okay, we need you to get some volunteers for us. Like they're on board with that. It's part of the process for them. They're fully part of the team and bought in that way. So I think that's a big piece of it. I think the largest piece with students, honestly, of anything, is word of mouth. We talk a lot with our students and all of our volunteers really just about who they want to bring along or who they think would be great to serve in the classroom. And they really do take that seriously. And so I think the biggest way that we tend to get new student volunteers specifically is because a friend invited them. Because one of their friends is a small group leader, really likes it, and invited their friend to come along. So now there's 2 of them, and now there's 3 of them, now there's 4 of them. We have a student I was just hearing this in a meeting a couple days ago. He is a sophomore in high school. He's in one of our kids' classrooms, I think our K1 classroom, and he's not going to be able to volunteer for the summer because of a summer job that he got. And he actually took it upon himself to recruit one of his friends to say, hey, I can't be here for the summer. I really love these kids. I want somebody to be here. Would you start volunteering with me? And then you could take my role for the year. He did that all on his own, which I think is like amazing, right? But that's just kind of the culture that has been created, is that these students have a lot of ownership. They're passionate about it, and they're bringing their friends along. And I think the third big piece for us that is probably a little different, but I am really, really passionate and I'm proud of, is we have at our church, we don't necessarily have any sort of like janitorial services. We have a cleaning crew made up of high schoolers, and we have a guy that oversees that is really more about the leadership development of those high schoolers than he is about the logistics of cleaning a church or set up and tear down and all that kind of stuff. And that's not to say he doesn't do it. They do it excellently, and I think that's a big piece of it. He's put a lot of time into developing those kids as leaders, and part of his expectation for him, for that group of kids. So there's at any given time, there's about 10 to 12 high school students on the cleaning crew, and the expectation on a weekend is that they serve one, sit one, work one. So what that means for them is that they're working one as a cleaning crew person that's, doing the trash and the bathrooms and all the stuff. They're sitting in church, and then also they're serving in a service. For most of them, that means children's, because that's where most of the students are. And I think that core group of kids who really does get involved, to me, this whole cleaning crew phenomenon has been fascinating, because these kids are like a perfect example of what you want leadership and discipleship to look like. They're learning to serve. They're learning to have a joyful attitude. They're being exposed to so many different pieces of ministry because of the things that they're involved in and things they're helping with. They're getting to spend a lot of time with our church staff just by nature of, they're there cleaning the offices when we're having the meeting, and hey, what do you think about that? Or, they're overhearing the conversations and they're being a part of that. And you're watching these kids specifically just absolutely thrive. as students within the ministry, where they go off to college and their careers. And I think that's honestly a huge part of the driver of having so many students involved in our ministries, is that those kids are kind of driving the bus on that. They do kind of become the cool club in our student ministry because they know everyone, they know where the keys are, like they know all the things. And that definitely influences the other students. So that's a huge piece of it.
Yeah, you've developed a culture where they want to be in, like
absolutely.
That's where they want to be in. Is there anything else you do that's like unique to student volunteers, like how you onboard them, how you celebrate them, how you train them, or is a lot of it really the same that you do for all volunteers, adults or students?
I think it's probably mostly the same. I mean, in terms of onboarding and training for all of our volunteers, what it looks like is every volunteer usually starts, most of their training is shadowing. They start by shadowing somebody in the role, kind of getting a feel for what it is, and then eventually kind of getting turned loose on their own. And then as part of that process, they attend what we call Volunteer 101, which is just an hour session that happens, during our services, where they come and sit in Volunteer 101. I teach that class, and it's exactly what you think it is. So it's all of the basics of family ministries, from real big vision cast, big picture, to strategy, why we do what we do, answering the most common questions, giving them a lot of the logistics and expectations to kind of set them up to succeed. We started doing that because we found that a lot of our even most bought-in volunteers had a lot of question marks. Or things where they didn't understand why we did something a certain way or why something was or wasn't a priority. And that we had gone a long time, like they could go a long time serving before they got some of those questions answered if they weren't willing to directly ask it, which oftentimes they're not. And so we created Volunteer 101 out of that as a way to say, hey, let's begin at the beginning and make sure you get all of this info up front so that you're walking into your volunteering already with the mindset of what our philosophy and strategy is, so that from day one, you're more on board with a lot of things, you understand a lot of things, you're not confused about anything. And that's made a really big impact on a lot of those volunteers that have walked through that process. Our students go through that same process, just like an adult. We treat our high school students very much like adults. In that sense, we expect the same things of them. We want the same things from them. And they're really, really capable of it. When you ask them to rise to it, they will.
That's great. I think my favorite approach when it comes to students is kind of like, in some ways you treat them just like any other volunteer, but it is cool to like mix in some things that are unique to students. Like maybe you do a party once a year for all student volunteers and they just get celebrated uniquely, or maybe there's an aspect of training that only they get, or I don't know, something like that seems great, but I don't love either extreme. I don't know if I love you only treat them like everybody else, or I definitely don't like the idea that it's just completely separate. Right.
And I think for us, like the nature of our ministry, because there are so many students, is that like the quote unquote regular volunteer is a student. So it's kind
That's
of
true.
geared that way,
Yeah.
It kind of already is slanted that way. And I think our staff is kind of slanted that way. For us, we're really passionate about with these students. What we see is our students that are more regular volunteers in children's or in any of our ministries at our church, because we have students that volunteer in other ministries as well. They're the ones who, once they graduate, and this should be like no surprise and isn't to anybody, are consistently sticking around in church and more plugged in and connected, and they actually stay. And I think the volunteering and the community that they build has a lot to do with it. And so for that reason, we attempt, like I said, to kind of treat them more like adults so that it still feels the same once they graduate. It's not like, well, I graduated, so now I don't get to go to the student thing, or I don't have this special, like, it's the same as it always was for them. A lot of other things in their life are changing at that point, but that thing, that volunteering that they do in the community they've built, stays very, very much the same for them. And I think that's significant for a lot of them.
Yeah, I think that is one of the biggest keys to keeping students connected after high school.
Mm-hmm.
Well, thanks for sharing some of this stuff with us. I mean, you're doing obviously a great job. I'm sure there are probably some other churches that are leveraging a high number of students in terms of the percentage of their volunteers, but I don't know that I've heard 73% before, at the camp. Maybe at a camp. I don't know. That is probably maybe a little more common. But certainly on Sundays, that's awesome. How can people connect with you if they have a question or want to follow up, either email or social media or something like that?
I think email is probably the best. And so my email, it's just my name. So it's Kellie.Krueger, which is KELLIE.KRUEGER at beachcities.org. Email is always the best way to connect with me. I'm one of those people that every email usually gets answered pretty quickly. So that's the best way to get in touch, I think.
Cool.
With me for any questions.
Awesome. Well, Kellie, thank you so much for coming on the podcast, for sharing all this with us, and keep up the great work. I hope you have a great kids games this summer.
Great. Thanks, Nick.
Pretty amazing, isn't it? 73% of our weekly volunteers are students, and same thing really for the kids camp week. I just think that's awesome. I thought it was interesting that student volunteers are more active and show up more regularly than adult volunteers. I can't say I'm totally surprised. Sometimes I've seen that even with things like a volunteer training. So what percentage of your team is made up of students? Or if you're a student pastor, what percentage of your students serve? I think in either case, whether you're in children's ministry or student ministry, that is a number you should watch, keep an eye on. That's something that is important. Like we talked about at the end, I think it really does have an impact on students owning their own faith and sticking after high school. I think that's really important. So here's some things you can do coming out of this interview. One is to look at your numbers, obviously, figure out where you are. And then another thing is to create a plan to invite students to serve. Maybe they do. And so your plan isn't going to invite them maybe to serve for the first time, but essentially to invite more students to serve. How can you grow the percent of your students who are serving? Can you double it? Is it 20% and now to be 40%? Whatever. And if you're in children's ministry, maybe you're going to work with your student ministry. Or if you're in student ministry, you're going to, contact the children's ministry and say, hey, I think we should talk and develop a plan together to help get more students serving in your ministry. And if they compete, if you have programming on Sunday morning for kids and students at the same time, I know this is drastic, but you might want to consider changing it. Should you have a conversation about student ministry meeting at a different time so they can actively serve on Sunday morning? Or do you push them to attend 2 services, which would be fine too? So I'll tell you what, this is kind of a small random action item, but one thing I wrote down coming out of there was just the idea of the daily recap email. I don't know if you caught that when she was talking about kids camp. We do a number of different things with retreats and camps for students. And I know I did, just for fun last year, I did like a Facebook Live behind the scenes look at one of the camps that we do for kids called Art Beat. And man, all the parents loved it. And I realized it's because they don't get to see that. Without me doing that Facebook Live, they know what happens, but they don't get to see it. They don't get to hear about it. They don't get details. And we do some of that to an extent. We give, some insight into what's going on for parents. But I thought the daily recap email was a pretty good idea. You can get all the documents and resources and things that Kellie shared, as well as the show notes. And if you want to email her all that stuff at nickblevins.com/episode 103. I hope this was helpful to you. I really hope all of us can empower students to serve more, to own their own faith more. It's absolutely critical. I'm totally biased because that happened for me when I was in high school growing up, and it has been foundational for my faith. But I really do think it's important for all of our students in our churches. So I'm grateful for Kellie. Love the work she's doing. I hope your church is leaning in to students as well and helping them own their own faith. Well, that's all we have for today. I hope you have a great week, and we'll catch you in the next episode of the Family Ministry Podcast.
Thanks for listening to the Nick Blevins Family Ministry Podcast. We hope this helps you maximize your church's potential. We would love to hear stories of how you apply what you've learned. You can do that by leaving a comment on iTunes or in the show notes at nickblevins.com.